Snow fell in slow, patient skeins over the leagues of brown, trampled field that lay before Winterfell. The sky had sunk into that northern half-light where day wears the face of evening and everything is the color of iron. Breath smoked from men and horses and the shaggy mules that drew wagons. Even the banners, direwolf gray, flayed man's pink and crimson, the black sunburst of Carhold, the snarling giant of Last Hearth, hung heavy, sodden with frost. Beyond, Winterfell's walls lifted like a hill of weathered stone. The ramparts rimed white, the broken crenels bandaged in fresh timber. From the godswood came the hoarse whisper of old leaves under snow and the soft crackle of ice in limbs that had not moved for 1,000 years. Jon sat his horse with a stillness that belied the churn in his chest. Ghost's fur was a pale fire against the brown flank of the mare as he paced close, red eyes fixed toward the Bolton line. Davos Seaworth drew nearer to Jon's knee, a square, compact shadow in a patched cloak, the wind tugging at his stubble and bluing his cheeks. Tormund Giantsbane stood on the other side in the saddle, a mountain of bones and fox hides and red beard, muttering something in the old tongue that might have been a prayer, a joke, or a curse. They had drawn up in a broad, cautious arc, the wildlings and hill clans making a ragged crescent, the Mormont foot under Lyanna's black bear, the Cerwyn men stiff with cold but determined, the handful of Hornwoods left alive, what Umbers they had, none here, all over there, and the spears of White Harbor that Lord Manderley had sent belatedly, more rumor than men. It was a thin line. It would have to hold. Across the field, Ramsay's army spread like a stain. The Karstarks starburst glimmered as if set with shards of frozen river. The great black and gray giant of Last Hearth snapped along a rank of massive men in boiled leather and fur, faces raw with wind and old war. Reavers from the Dreadfort grinned under their patched hoods. Archers massed, horses tossed heads. The flayed man japed under the pale sun. Between the two armies, the no-man's field lay brazed by hoof and foot and the memory of older feuds. A narrow strip of ground had been left open, a place where men could pretend to speak before killing one another. Jon looked at it, then at Davos. Once he rides out, he will refuse single combat, Davos said. He's a showman. He wants a field of bodies to be his stage. We know what he wants, Jon answered. I want the men who stand behind him to hear another voice. You are set on this? Davos asked. Yes. Tormund's horse snorted steam. If he offers you ale, don't drink it, the wildling said. If he offers you bread, don't eat it. If he offers you a woman, Jon looked at him. Tormund shrugged. Don't take the woman. A trumpet barked from the Bolton side. Ramsay Bolton came forward with a small knot of mounted men, house guards in heavy mail with the flayed man on their coats, an archer with a gilded quiver, a pale Karstark banner knight, and the man himself in a cloak stitched with pink silk, as if he had taken the skin from some summer sail and thrown it over his shoulders. His smile was the kind a cat gives a cornered mouse. They met in the middle. Wind combed the grass. Snow dusted Ramsay's shoulders and did not dare make him shiver. Snow, he said softly, the bastard of Winterfell, back for his father's hearth. I suppose that's touching. Jon looked past him into the mass of men. He could feel the Karstark eyes, the Umber eyes, the small fears and the large grudges moving through them like foxes. He remembered Great Jon Umber's laugh filling the rafters of Winterfell long ago, and the weight of Rickard Karstark's hand on Robb's hall table as he swore his sword. He remembered the way Stark men had bled when Rickard had butchered captives, and how Robb had made himself an Oathkeeper and a Kingslayer all at once. The past had scattered pricks of light across the field like ice chips. He tried to lay his voice across them. I came for my home, he said, and for my family. Your name is Bolton. You should never have had it. My name is Snow. I never asked for it, but I never ran from the north either. He let that sit, a stone on crusted snow. You've heard what's coming with winter. Some of you saw it at Hardhome. The dead don't care what your name is or what songs your father sang. They care that you are warm and breathing. They care that you are food. Ramsay's smile crooked, amused, indolent. Ah, the ghost stories again. Jon ignored him. He lifted himself a little in the saddle and pitched his voice past Ramsay, as if the flayed man were a stump in the field. "Men of Karhold," he called. "Men of Last Hearth. I don't forgive the men who betrayed my house. I will never forgive the man who tortured my sister and took my brother from me. But I was raised by Eddard Stark in a hall where we said a lord's word binds him, and we said it loud. I offer you pardon here before gods and men. Lay down your arms when battle is joined. Come to me when you can, or stand aside if you cannot. When this day is done, if I stand and Winterfell stands, you may come in peace and take bread and salt. Your families will not hang for the choices your lords made. The women and children who wait for you at Karhold and Last Hearth will be fed from Winterfell's stores. Your dead will be buried under stone, not burned in a field for carrion." A murmur went through the ranks like wind through dried reeds. Men leaned toward one another. A Karstark captain, a man with a scar like a hook through his cheek, sat stiffer than before. In the Umber line, Jon thought he saw a broad man shift in the saddle and twist to look back, as if checking that the eyes behind his own were watching. A Bolton guard coughed. Ramsay's smile did not falter, but the muscles in his jaw worked once. "You will forgive me," Ramsay said thinly, "if I don't allow my men to be seduced by pretty words." "Pretty words," Jon repeated. "Bread, salt, and winter grain are prettier than your flayed men. Your hounds can eat their fill when the dead march, or they can die first. Single combat, then." Ramsay cut across, bored. "Save all this pageantry. We both know you want to swing your sword and pretend it matters." "You'd refuse," Jon said. Ramsay laughed softly. "Of course I refuse. Where would be the fun in letting you die alone?" He leaned forward in the saddle, eyes half-lidded with pleasure. "I have something of yours." Jon kept his face still. The urge to ask, "Rickon?" was a small animal clawing his throat. He swallowed it because answers gave Ramsay meat to chew. Ramsay raised his hand, and a guard wheeled and cantered back toward the Bolton lines. Jon heard the ripple of attention move through Bolton ranks. He braced for the boy in bonds, the rope, the taunt, the arrow. He felt Ghost gather under his hand, and he measured the distance in his mind, knowing he could not cross it in time. But the guard did not return. Ramsay waited a long heartbeat, too. The pale Karstark banner knight shifted. The archer in the gilded quiver glanced sideways. Jon caught, just barely, the curl of Ramsay's lip. Something had not been ready. Something was amiss. He heard Davos exhale. "Tomorrow morning," Ramsay declared in an instant, as if that had been his plan all along, "we'll dance. If you want to say your prayers, say them now. If you want to freeze, freeze. You've told your story. Very moving." He smiled again, that cat smile. "I look forward to telling mine." He wheeled his horse with a jerk and trotted back through the snow, the cluster of escorts closing around him. Jon watched them return and saw the small pockets of whispering bloom among the Karstark and Umber companies like patches of black mold. "That hit him," Davos said softly. "Not like a sword, like a stone in his boot." "And maybe a stone in 100 boots," Jon answered. He let his eyes rest on the Karstark starburst again. "If there's a crack, we push at it." Tormund hawked and spat. "Cracks are for men who hide behind walls. We are not hiding, Crow." He peered toward the Bolton host. "But I know a look when men feel a rope on their neck, and I saw it twice. The ones with the long beards, they remember your father. The big ones, Umbers, they remember biting. They like a man who bites." Jon turned his horse. "We make sure bread and salt are ready to prove my word," he said. "And tonight we make room in the dark for more than fear." When they rode back through Winterfell's gate, Sansa was waiting on the steps with her cloak wrapped tight up to her chin. Her hair, pale as fresh oak shavings, lay braided over one shoulder. Snow had caught in it like ash. Behind her stood Brienne, a straight winter tree in armor, and Podrick with cheeks so pink they looked painted. "Well?" Sansa asked, voice level. "He tried to stage his theater," Jon said. "Something inside his camp misstepped. He delayed the show." He dismounted, and Ghost nosed Sansa's glove and huffed. "I said what I meant to say." Brienne's eyes flicked across his face. And the Karstark and Umber men heard you. They heard me, Jon said. Sansa's gaze stayed very steady. And when the arrows fly, do words stop them? No, Jon said, and felt tired because she was right to ask. But they might turn the hands that loose them. Sansa's lips whitened and then softened. She took a breath and let it out slow, and in the breath Jon recognized that she had spent part of the morning in the Godswood and part in the stores, counting sacks and fear together. You should know, she said finally, that I sent a raven. Jon watched her mouth form the word and felt the shape of it in the cold air between them, as if the raven were a small, black thought flitting toward him. He did not ask to whom. He did not need to. If they come, he said after a moment, we make use of them. If they don't, she said, we remember that I asked you not to trust mercy. He had to smile at that. Not a laugh, not with their father's land under another man's boot, but a brief human shape. Mercy isn't trust, he said. It's a wager. I'm wagering that the North remembers it, too. That night the snow came harder, in thick flakes that muted the camp to a hush broken by the ring of hammer on spike, the creak of timber, the low murmur of men saying small things to one another because large things were too heavy to lift. Jon moved among them as he'd seen his father do before the winter hunts. Not a lord with orders, but a presence that made men straighten and then relax their shoulders. He stopped where Lyanna Mormont had her 12 gathered around her and nodded to the girl who commanded like an old woman and whose jaw shook only from the cold. He paused where the hill clansmen sang a song that called wolves from valleys. He watched a brother of the Night's Watch, one of the handful who had come with him, black cloak dull with rime, feed steaming stew to an old man whose teeth were gone, and he felt in his ribs the ache to be back at the wall where things had been simple in their hardness. Enemy to the north, friend to the south. Now the snow had come south, and the enemies moved. Near midnight, a man in a patched gray cloak was brought to Davos's tent by 2 hillmen. He stood with the tent flap spilling wine into his face and kept his hands where the knives could see them. He had the bulk of an Umber and the eyes of a man who'd cut his last slice of bread thinner than he'd meant to. Ser Davos. The man began, throat working around the honorific as if it were a foreign fishbone. I was told there's a smuggler with you. I followed him in stories for half my years. Davos lifted his head from the map. Smuggler is a word with as many faces as a coin, he said. But I wore it once. Who are you? Donal, the man said. Donal Umber of a lesser branch. I've kin in the molehills around Last Hearth and a brother who hunts elk more than he sleeps. He swallowed. My lord, my lord. He could not bring himself to say Ramsay. He went on with a jerk. He'll play with the Stark boy in the morning, if his mood holds. He wanted to do it today, but there was a thing in the camp. Words passed. Harold Karstarks struck a man, one of ours, who said his vows to the Starks were older than the Bolton's new crown. There was a scuffle. It will break full open tomorrow if any crack is given. You came here to tell us to give it, Davos said. I came to tell you that if a thing can be done about the boy, tonight is when a thing can be done, Donal said. We have men on the north wall of the inner yard who... He stopped, and now he swallowed twice, as if each had a name. Who would rather be wolves than hounds? They're on watch until the second cockcrow. After that, the Dreadfort men take over. They'll not turn. Ours might. Davos looked at Jon over the map, a question and a warning in his expression. Can you bring us to that wall? Jon asked. I can bring you to a sally door under it, Donal said. We use it to drag carcasses out to the midden in deep winter. The bolt is on our side. But I cannot bring an army. We don't need an army, Jon said. He looked at Tormund, who had been sitting on a keg with a little grin that had not dimmed with cold. We need men who are quiet until they aren't. Half an hour later, they were moving along the ditch line in a conga of shadow. Ghost a pale smear that made Jon fight the urge to put a hand to his fur. Davos kept close, the shape of his missing fingers a memory in the dark as he checked ropes, tested a spike, passed a coil back. Tormund breathed like a bellows at Jon's shoulder, and then the wildling was simply gone over the lip, a darkness sliding down into darker. They waited in the hush while snow filled the small hollows Tormund left behind. They reached the base of Winterfell's inner wall at a place where a midden gave off a sweet, rotten breath even in this cold. The sally door was a low, iron-bound thing with old black stains in the grain of the wood. Donald rapped once, twice, and again, a pattern like a child's rhyme, then pressed his ear to the seam. A voice came low through the crack. One word, harsh. Donald replied with three softer, and the bolt withdrew with a long metallic scrape that sounded to John like a raven choking on a thorn. The door opened enough to let a man in sideways. Tormund put his shoulder to it and it opened more. Within, three men with the look of the north. Broad faces, cheeks bristled, eyes used to daylight on snow. Stood not with swords bared but with hands flexing over them, as if still deciding whether they were ready to lift them. One of them had a threadbare scarf in Karstark black around his throat. "We have a little time," Donald said quickly. "The kennel boys sleep beside the dogs. The Stark boy is not in the cells tonight. He's in a feed room in the roundhouse under lock. The one with the smith symbol over the door, hammer and tongs. They're moving him to the yard at dawn." "You don't know this," Tormund said with a skepticism that was almost respect. Donald stepped aside, and another man moved forward. A small, wiry figure with eyes that snapped bright gray under a sheepskin hood. His hands were scarred and flecked with old burns. "I'm which they'd call a smith if there were iron to work," he said. "The feed room is under my loft. I know the tread of every guard that passes, and the tread of the boy when he turns on his straw. He has the Stark look. I put my cloak over him when the wind squealed." John felt his breath change. In the dark, it seemed vulgar to say thank you. He nodded instead. "We need 2 men to come with us," he said. "No more than that. We'll take the boy. If there's alarm, break things. Every loud thing you can think of." The smith showed his teeth. They were small and well kept. "I can think of many loud things," he said. They moved like ink through a charcoal drawing. The yard seemed to abhor them and open its own smears for them. The roundhouse where the castle kept feed was a squat mushroom near the armory. A lantern burned behind a shutter. 2 guards sat with their backs to the door, feet stretched. Heads dropped and lifted and dropped like boats in a small swell. The warm, stale smell of men too tired for vigilance hanging around them. Tormund put a hand on John's arm, his big head cocked. "Dogs," he mouthed. John listened and heard, beneath the wind, the soft chain hum of a dog breathing through a muzzle. He nodded. He put a hand to Ghost's neck. The dire wolf turned his head up, red eyes banking. John put his mouth near Ghost's ear and breathed out. The dire wolf sank to his belly without a sound and slithered toward the corner of the roundhouse. Davos counted under his breath. At 3, Tormund rose like a wave and came down with the edge of his axe haft on the nearest guard's temple. A sound like a melon going soft. John came in behind the second, one hand covering the mouth, the other drawing his head back as Davos drove a knife hilt into his nose. Both bodies went slack. The lantern guttered behind the shutter with a small complaint. Ghost was a sheet of snow and something darker as he slid into the gap where the feed room door's base did not reach the flags. The direwolf's chest compressed. His ribs made a shape in white fur, then disappeared. John shut his eyes for a heartbeat. He felt, in that old strange way that he did not speak of even with those who knew him close, the cool boards against Ghost's flank and the smell of old hay and the hot sharp scent of a boy who had not cried since he learned that crying fed the handlers. Ghost's teeth took wood where the hasp met plank. The wood said nothing to the night. 3 heartbeats. 4. On the 5th, the hasp cracked like a deer bone. The door juddered. Tormund shouldered it once and it gave. They were in among sacks and a collapsed bale, and the shapes men became when they sleep in a place meant for beasts. Rickon Stark lay curled under a cloak too big for him, hair matted, face thin as a deer late in winter, eyes open and flat because closed eyes are worse when men can do what they want to eyes. John knelt and put his hand not on Rickon's shoulder but on the floor just beside him. Rickon's gaze slid to it as if it were something alive. "It's me," John said, voice no more than air. "It's John. I'm gonna pick you up, all right? Don't fight me." The boy did not fight. He did not help either. He let himself be gathered like kindling. Ghost flowed back out ahead of them, a pale tide licking at the crack under the door, and then they were moving through that charcoal drawing again, across the yard, under a wall's shadow, toward the little door where men took out broken things to throw to the dump. The kennel woke. It was a sound like hell remembering itself. First a throat, then 10 throats, then the clatter of chain as the dogs threw themselves against stalls and the wooden pegs jumped. A shout went up from a tower. 2 more. Men with lanterns began to move. An alarm bell rang, the old sound like a church refusing to die. "Run," Davos said simply, not loud, because the word itself had a shape that men understood without volume. They ran. The sally door heaved, and then was a black square with white beyond. One of the Karstark men drove his shoulder under the bar to hold it a moment longer. Jon felt Rickon's ribs against his own as the boy's breath, every third, caught ragged as if remembering how to be breath. They spilled into the midden's cut, slid, staggered, caught themselves, then were up the slope like beasts, scrabbling against slick. Jon did not let go. Ghost flashed past him and turned to snarl at men who would put hands to Jon's cloak. A crossbow twanged overhead and a bolt bent itself in the frozen dirt. Voices rose at their backs, angry, high, frightened, more than the 3 kinds mixed. They came over the lip and were suddenly in a world that had been waiting for them. Hillmen with ropes, Tormund's long arms gathering, the hiss of a signal that was only a man's breath through teeth. Davos looked back once as they pulled the door shut and dropped their bodies against it and slid the bolt up. A lantern moved in the yard and a guard's shout climbed an octave as he pointed at the place where the door had been. But the door, to guards at a distance, was simply a door. They moved. The night ate them quickly, the wind's teeth hiding their passage. By the time a horn spoke from the ramparts, they were past the ditch and into the camp shadows where fires were banked low. Rickon's weight was a thin burden, his silence a heavy one. Inside Jon's tent, Sansa stood as if turned from marble. For a breath, she was not Sansa Stark, not Lady of Winterfell, not a survivor. She was a girl, suddenly, eyes torn open, mouth unshaped. Jon set Rickon down and stepped back, and Sansa moved as if she were wind and he were only a reed. Rickon wept. The sound came late, like a thaw days after the sun turned. He made it into Sansa's cloak and she made noises that were not words. Brienne stood in the corner and looked away because some things are not for knights to see. Davos put his hand on the tent pole and rested his forehead against it for a moment. Ghost turned a circle and lay with his chin on his paws, tail thumping once against the rugs. When the weeping had run itself to a shiver, Jon knelt again. He touched Rickon's head. "Tomorrow will be a fight," he said. "Not a game. Do you understand?" Rickon's eyes were a pale, fever-diluted hazel. He nodded once. His chin trembled. "Shaggy dog," he whispered, and Sansa closed her eyes and pressed her mouth to his hair. "I know," Jon said softly. "I know." Dawn came grayer than most, as if the sky had regretted being born to it. They formed ranks. The Bolton horns called men in tidy blocks that made a northern eye sick at heart for what they used to be. Ramsay came out with his guard and found a space on a small rise from which to watch and smile. When his men brought him word that the Stark boy was not in his place, his face altered only by a degree. The smile turned from the mouth's corners inward and up, becoming a private, mean thing. He pointed, and archers moved like pieces on a board he had learned too young to love. He pointed again, and the Karstark cavalry shook itself into motion. He pointed a third time, and the Umber foot grunted and set spears and went forward with short, brutal steps. Jon's line braced. Lyanna Mormont shouted instructions to men twice her height, and they obeyed. Tormund spat in his hands and laughed. Davos' face went blank in the way of men who have learned that thinking of the long yield makes your hands slow. The first flight of Bolton arrows arced, a black, elegant rain. Jon's men raised shields and hunched. The arrows rattled and thudded and stuck, and men made the small animal noises that mean surprise and hurt and refusal to die yet. Jon lifted Longclaw slightly, and as the second flight hissed in, his right flank moved. It did not wheel as much as sway, like trees, leaving a space where he had told them, ordered them to leave one. It was a trap that relied on wildlings being willing to be trampled so that the Umber spears would surge into a pocket and find themselves snapped. The Umbers saw it. The first ranks started to shift. Jon saw shoulders lean, knees bend to step lateral. He watched one sergeant smack a spear but against a shin to align the man next in file. And in that sideways motion, in the momentary unsettle of habit, something else moved too. A decision. 100 men do not decide at once, but perhaps 4 do. Perhaps those 4 are the ones at the edges of long-held grudges and new fears. In the Umber block, a file peeled not left, not into Jon's pattern, but back a single short step. In the Karstark cavalry, a dozen riders en echelon eased their mounts' noses to the wind and did not trot when the horn said trot. And in Ramsay's little stage yard on the rise, the Lord himself turned that private smile down and to the side for the span of a second, because he had seen it too and did not love it. Now, Davos said, and the wildlings went forward with a roar that was not the sound of men going to kill, but the sound of men going to break something that had been clutching at their ribs. They met the spear points with shields and fur and iron and their own weight. Spears went in and men went down, but the weight did what weight does. Carried. The Karstark riders came on, but less cleanly than a lord with a new name had paid for. 2 captains tried to force a wedge into Jon's left, and one of those captains found himself riding alone. His rank shortened by the space of 3 mounts where riders had held back and then, with a visible physical shudder, pulled rein so abruptly that tack creaked and the mounts tossed their heads as if offended. Ramsay's smile did not falter. He raised a hand and swiveled a forefinger, and a block of Dreadfort men ran forward to fill the hole he had seen. They punched hard into Jon's middle. Men went to their knees. A house horn wailed a note like grief. Somewhere a hillman who had told a long joke the night before fell with his mouth open in what had been the first line of another. Jon saw it tilt and put his heels to the mare. Longclaw came out and the world contracted to the width of its blade. A man with a boar's tooth on a thong raised a pike and Jon took it at the wrist. The hand sprang open like a flower and the pike skittered. Ghost was a flash. A throat went wide and dark and then flat. Tormund entered the Dreadfort block as if he had always belonged to this work and would always belong to it until someone stopped his heart. Jon felt the push of men at his back, that small, necessary trust that comes when you ride into a place where a man alone is only leather and red water. He had thought the day's pivot would come when men remembered mercy. He was wrong. It came when a man remembered shame. In the Karstark rank, a rider with the scar-hooked cheek who had sat so rigid at the parley lifted his sword halfway, lowered it, lifted it again. Jon saw him like a candle flame in a shutter and then saw him turn his horse. Not toward Jon's line, not to break, but sideways into the Bolton men who had moved to push the Karstark wedge. He went in shouting not words but names. Eddard Stark, Robb Rickard, and his sword chopped a Dreadfort man out of the saddle. For a breath he was alone, a single man moving wrong in the stream. Then the men behind him, who had not chosen not to move but had not chosen to move, chose. They followed him. It was not a clean break. It was a tangle. Men turned horses that did not want to turn. Spears caught on mail and were ripped out of hands. The Karstark starburst on a half-dozen pennons swung one way and then the other like corn in a gust before it settled and leaned into Jon's wind. On the Umber side, Donal shouted himself hoarse and then found he had a voice left. The first 2 ranks went on. Their momentum was a thing made of duty and frost and the fear of a Bolton flaying table. But the 3rd and 4th felt the give and stepped back, like men realizing a floor is not there. They did not run. They did not charge. They unclenched. Ramsay's finger did not draw tight little circles now. It stabbed the air toward men who were not where he had placed them. He jerked his hand as if he would summon them with a string. He stood on his little hill and looked very small indeed. It would have been then, the place in the game where a lord with a taste for cruelties uses the cruelest thing, to drag the boy out, to put the rope in his hand and the arrow on the string. But the kennel had woken hours before, and the feed room door had broken, and the boy's breath was now the sound of it in Sansa's cloak. Ramsay had nothing to play except men who had heard a different man's promise. The Dreadfort block held. because fear hardens where honor melts. Ramsay's houseguard committed like a plug of iron. John's center bent, not to breaking but to a long moan a blacksmith might make when a temper runs. Arrows went on singing their tune, an old one. Bodies made drifts like short, grim snowbanks. If the day had hung there another half hour, it would have turned into a meat grinder with no songs, and winter would have eaten both sides the same. But the day did not hang. Tilted, the horns that sounded to the west made sound like a memory of falcons. Men turned. They always turned toward hope or fear. The veil came with the wind at their backs. Lances down, banners brave in the dim, as if they alone remembered the way silk should move in sun. Peter Baelish rode out of a view he had been savoring for an hour, his eyes hooded like a hawk's, his smile the careful nothing he wore when he had just won a bet he had made against himself. The Vale charge struck the Dreadfort block on the angle John had dreamed of and could not purchase with anything he possessed. Men went down and did not rise. The plug of iron became scattered filings. Tormund laughed again, a brighter laugh, and was borne forward on the tide he loved. Harold Karstark came out of the press to John's left like a stag shouldering out of a river, bowled a man aside with the bulk of his horse, then saw John and checked. His face was stone-flooded with blood. He lifted his sword, point not at John but up, and bared his teeth. "Bread and salt," he shouted, voice raw. "Bread and salt, Starks, you said it. I will hold to it," John shouted back, because promises are not only for the quiet hall. Then he was in it again, Longclaw cutting a path through three men who had decided somewhere in their lives that pain was other people's burden. The world shrank and expanded as it does in the crush. Small details blooming, the way snow clung to a man's beard hair like icing, the tiny tear at the edge of a shield leather, and then vanishing under the big things of blood and iron and breath. They took the field in an hour that seemed to be a day that seemed to be a minute. Ramsay's men fell back toward Winterfell as if the earth itself had become slick under their boots. The flayed man banners reeled. The Umbers pulled apart into a rag of lines, then into angry bands, then into men who wanted to stop and did not know how to do it in a battle without death. The Karstarks made a strange island in the crush, banding around their captains while holding their swords low, faces set in that particular northern misery you only see on men who have learned that doing right will taste a little of ash for months. One's bellow shook the snow out of the air. The giant had come forward late, at Jon's insistence and over Tormund's scorn, because the giant loved to break gates and deserved not to be killed where the ground could trap his legs. He was already bleeding from a dozen long wounds where arrows had gone in and broken or been pulled free. He threw a log the length of 3 horses into a knot of men who were trying to find courage at the sight of one another's faces and scattered them like pins. Ramsay's archers turned to put shafts in him. Ghost sprang among their legs like a ghost that could draw blood. Men went down with their strings slack, bodies bitten in places men do not expect to be bitten in battle. They reached the gate. One put his hands on the timbers and pushed, and the old wood moaned like a ship. Arrows chalked his chest and neck, sprouted from his cheek like dark reeds. He pushed again, and the gate gave a little, its hinges squealing like boars. Men shouted from the wall walk, oil sloshed blackly in troughs. "Douse it," Jon said, and 3 hillmen with buckets that had held water for horses slopped what was left against the gate. It made a sheen that would not keep fire from biting but might keep it from biting deep. One bent, took breath that was half blood, then straightened and roared. The gate cracked like a good bone. On the 3rd push it broke. They went in under the teeth of the portcullis where it had hung and been broken once before, under the murder holes, into a yard that had been home and had been not home and now smelt of the wrong men. The yard swirled with combat. Ramsay's houseguard made a brave ring around a lord who was not brave. The ring pressed out and in, trying to find a path for him that did not exist. Jon found himself very suddenly, as unexpectedly as a man stumbling on a door in the dark, looking at Ramsay. Ramsay lifted a bow that had not seen the string break all day and smiled as he loosed. The arrow whispered past Jon's cheek and lodged in the helm of a man behind him with a black, ugly clink. Jon walked toward him, and Ramsay loosed again, and the 2nd arrow scratched a line across Jon's ribs that burned cold. The third thudded into the heavy fur over John's shoulder. Ghost came low, but John lifted a hand, and the direwolf stopped, panting. "No," John said, and he did not know if he spoke to the wolf or to the part of him that wanted to kill without a face to look at. He walked the last 6 paces, lifted his shield, took the 4th arrow there, then swung it aside and was inside the bow's length, and Ramsay wasn't smiling now. John did not make words. He put his shoulder to Ramsay's chest, and the two of them went down in a confusion of limbs, the bow clattering away. Ramsay's hands were fast and good. He got a knife from somewhere, a slim, elegant thing, and cut a line under John's ear that stung deep. John took his wrist and hit it on the cobbles once, twice, until the knife fell. He hit Ramsay's face the way a man hammers a stake, and blood came, and a tooth, and then something gentler than anything Ramsay had ever done in his life put its hand on John's shoulder. Sansa stood above them, breathing as if she had run a long way through snow. "John," she said, just his name. He looked up. The yard was a weather of movements and sounds, but somehow he could hear her. He was breathing like a bellows. He let go of Ramsay's wrist. He stood up, slowly, because everything hurt and because stopping is always slower than starting. He looked at Sansa and then down at Ramsay, who was smiling again, even with blood filling his mouth, because he had found art in his defeat, a way to make the last word his. "You can't kill me," Ramsay whispered. "You promised bread and salt. You promised mercy. The men will watch that." John looked at him. "Mercy is for men," he said. "And you are not a man?" Ramsay breathed, laughing through blood. "You made sure I wasn't when you put my sister in a bed," John said, and his voice was a thing made of winter bark. He turned to the men around them. "Bind him," he said. "He will answer for what he did. He will answer under the old laws. We will not be him." There was a murmur, a ripple of assent that was relief and admiration together. 2 hillmen dragged Ramsay up and bound his hands with thong. Brienne stood close, her mouth a hard line and her eyes wet as if the cold had crawled inside them. "Lord Snow," said a voice behind him, a voice raw as if it had not been used in a year. John turned. Harold Karstarks stood there without a sword, hands open, his face so full of a kind of stubborn pain that he looked like a new carving. He bent his head, not in the southern way of a bow but in the northern way of showing your throat, a trust and a threat at once. "I brought my men against you. I have nothing to say to make that smaller. But I heard what you said in the field, and what you said then you stand to now. I am not asking to be forgiven. I am asking to be judged like a son of the North." John looked past him to the Karstark men, who stood in a cluster with their blades points low, watching their lord's mouth not because they would necessarily obey it, but because they were trying to hear their own consciences in it. He looked to the Umber men, who clumped in the same uneasy way. Donnell was among them, face blank as a field of snow after the wind has smoothed it. "After the dead are burned," John said, "we'll speak in the hall, all of us, every man who came here with a sword and breath and a claim to be a Northman. We will speak by the weirwood, where words are loud." He looked back to Ramsay. "First I'll see to the wounded." In the great hall that night the fires ran high in the pits and the beams sweated and dripped. The banners had gone back to the places they knew, and men looked at them with the hunger of those who've come home to bread. Rickon lay on a bench wrapped in furs. He was asleep with his mouth open like a small animal. Sansa sat near him, one hand on his ankle where it lay under the pelts, as if she could anchor him to the world. Brienne leaned against a post not far off. She had the look of a woman who can sleep standing if she must. John stood where his father had stood and looked out at faces that were old songs and new lines. He felt the weight of the room settle on his shoulders and then settle inside them, like a cloak one chooses to put on. "You heard me this morning," he said. "I keep my word. Men of Carhold, men of Last Hearth. If your sword is bloodied with a Stark's blood done in murder, there is no bread at this table for you, only the rope. If you came under your lord's banner and held there because you were born to and bound to, you have bread and salt if you will bend the knee to Winterfell and leave the flayed man in the ditch." Those of you whose lords died today, that is no fault of yours. You swore to an old house once. You can swear now to the one that remembers you." Harold Karstark came forward, face set. He sank to one knee and bowed his head. "My father chose wrong," he said into the rushes. "I chose wrong. Karhold is cold and stands under the aurora, and we make our bread hard as boards, and our children learn not to cry. That is nothing if a man breaks with honor. If you'll have us, we'll put our swords where they ought to be put and our grain where you need it." John nodded and lifted his hand, palm outward. "Rise," he said. "We'll speak of hostages and oaths and winter stores tomorrow when the sun's up. Tonight you drink my ale because it is not mine, it is the North's." He turned then and looked for Donal among the Umbers. He found him and crooked 2 fingers, and the man came forward, stiff-legged, as if unused to being called for something that wasn't a beating. "If there is a great John," John said, voice carrying, "he isn't here. If there is a small John, some of you say he fell with a wildling's hands on his throat and his own men spit on his boots. That's the song. I don't care for the song. The truth is you stood where you stood today and then you moved. That's what I care for. Your boys will eat this winter under their roof. You send them to haul stone for the new walls and to fell trees for the palisades, and we'll feed them twice for it, because they will be defending themselves when they defend Winterfell. If you bend your stubborn heads now, I'll bend mine to make space." Donal sank awkwardly, as if unused to kneeling. "I bend it," he said, and looked up with a face that had turned younger by 10 years in an hour. Sansa watched all this with a face that did not show what she thought, which was both a lesson she had learned and a kindness she was offering Jon. Because in a hall men do not need to see the broke parts of one another to gather. When the oaths had gone round and the clatter of mugs had softened into the irregular music of relief, she stood and went to Jon at the high table. "You made yourself loved," she said. She said it in a tone that was not exactly admiration and not exactly warning. "I made myself bound," Jon answered, "to them and to the words I spoke." "They will test those bindings," Sansa said. "Peter Baelish will help them test them." "We will pass his tests by not sitting for them," Jon replied, and she half laughed despite herself. Later, under the heart tree, Jon stood with Davos, and the weirwood face looked down like an old friend too tired to change expression. The bark's carved features were filled with new snow. The red leaves made little whispers as if the tree were finishing sentences men had started and abandoned. Jon put his hand to the trunk. It was cold and somehow welcoming. "I was a fool once," Davos said. "Old fools can be more dangerous than young ones, but sometimes they can remember the words that mattered. Bread and salt, a king's justice, a lord's word." "I'm not a king," Jon said, so softly that the wind would have stolen it if the tree had not leaned a fraction. He remembered a long hall in the south and men calling Robb that word and his brother trying it on like a cloak and then being stabbed to death under a naked ceiling where there were too many men with too many knives. He remembered his own breath stopping and starting again on the wall with a red woman's hands over him and the taste in his mouth that has no name. "No," Davos said, "and that's why they may ask you to be one." He was right. They did. It began with Lyanna Mormont, because the world enjoys its ironies. She rose on her feet at the end of that long dark day while men were still wiping fat from their lips and the dead were still cooling in the pits, and she said what the room could not help but hear. She said the North remembered, and it remembered Jon Snow when others had been warm with crowns. She said their fathers had sworn to Stark blood, and this was Stark blood whether the wolf was tinctured or not. She said the boy Rickon was Stark too and would sit in the chair he had the right to sit in when his legs were long enough to reach the floor, but that winter was upon them now and winter wanted a man who knew how to say the hard words and keep them. She said she was small and he was not, but people had already heard that song, so she would sing another, "King in the North." It went through the hall like fire through dry brush. Jon looked at Sansa. She did not smile. She did not frown. She looked like a woman who had found herself sitting on a bed of nettles and did not intend to let anyone know where the stings were. He looked at Rickon, who slept with his mouth open and his hair in his eyes. He looked at the faces around him. Karstark, Umber, Manderly, Glover, Men who had been on both sides of the line 10 hours ago and now were here with their daughters' ears turning red in the heat and their sons chewing meat and failing not to dribble. He raised a hand and the hall quieted, because a man who has been obeyed in a field holds that tone for a night or two. "I am not the rightful lord of Winterfell," he said. "Rickon is. He will sit where my father Saturday." There was an uneven rumble, confusion searching for an alley. He lifted his other hand. "But there is a war that is not about chairs and halls. There is a war coming to the walls themselves. I have seen it. I have fought it. If you want to cry a word that will hold men through that, I will not forbid it. But if you call me king, remember what you mean by it. Not a man to hand out favors and take your oaths with gold in his eyes. A man to get you through the cold. A man who will go where the cold is and break off the first piece of it with his teeth." They called him. The word filled the beams and ran up the chimneys and was thrown back by the snow in the yard. He felt it lay on him like a weight and a shield at once. He met Sansa's eyes again and saw, just for an instant, pride war with something that had lived too long in the dark. She came to him after and put her hand on his arm. "I won't let him have you," she said. "Littlefinger?" he asked. "Any of them," she said. They hung Ramsay by the old laws, after a formal naming of the crimes and a vigil in which he was given water and no warmth. He did not beg. That would have been his last jest, and he did not give it. He died like a man angered at being made quiet. Sansa did not go to the hanging. She went, later, to the place where he had kept the dogs and stood there for a long time until the smell was no longer just the smell of dogs, but the smell of old straw and the little girl she had been sitting on it with her hands in her lap. The days thickened. Snow made its own schedule. Ravens came from the wall with words black as their feathers. Wildlings went north in fat boots, then came back with thinner faces and eyes that had seen the white horizon move. The Karstarks sent men to haul stone. Umber boys learned to fletch arrows in the yard under the eye of an old Night's Watchman who had known Jon's father and had taught him, once, to hold a bow and not to shake when a target looked at him like a man. Bran Stark came home on a clear noon that made a bright skin on the snow. He came in a sledge and looked like an old god had decided, for a little while, to keep company with the living. His mouth said little. His eyes said too much. He took Jon's hands and kissed Sansa's cheek, and when he touched Rickon's head the boy looked up and smiled, then frowned, and then smiled again as if a story had just walked through him from one side to the other. That night, in the room their father had used to read letters in the peace after supper, Bran told Jon about a tower and a scream and a woman with dark hair and a promise. He told him everything because he had learned that telling part is worse. Jon stood very still because if he moved the world would, and the world had moved enough for a man for one lifetime. "What would you have me do with this?" Jon asked at last. "Know it," Bran said, and Jon loved him then in a way that frightened him. Because love in winter is a thing that can be broken very easily by the weight of a single piece of falling ice. Bran's eyes lifted to the window and to the small patch of stars in it. "Use it only when using it would save more than it would kill. Being a Stark is not simple," Jon said. "It never was," Bran answered, and the old gods rustled their leaves, amused at how new men always thought they had discovered old truths. When the raven came from Dragonstone smelling of salt and dust, Jon read it twice and then put it down and looked at Sansa and Davos and the map of the north. "She has dragons," Davos said, "the way a man remarks on the weather when the weather intends to kill him. I've seen kings with fires in their bellies and on their banners. They are not the same as dragons." "She has fire and I need fire," Jon said. "Dragonglass, fire in the sky, names that make old enemies fall quiet." Sansa's mouth went to a line. "She is a queen," she said. "She will want kneeling. She will want more than kneeling." "I will give her what is mine to give," Jon answered. "I won't give her what is Winterfell's to keep." "You'll be gone," Sansa said. "The men need a Stark on the chair." "Rickon will be here," Jon said. He looked at the boy, trying to wrap a leather thong around a short stick and make it look important. "He will learn to be a lord by watching the woman who taught herself to be one. And if men come into this hall and ask to pull us apart, he will see you say no." "I will," Sansa said. and for the first time since they had hung Ramsay, he saw that she believed it wholly. They went south by ship with a handful of men whose eyes did not like the way the sea moved under them. John took Davos and a Manderley, and against his own sense of the story that had formed around him, he took a Karstark and an Umber, because bread and salt are verbs, not nouns. Donal came reluctantly, rubbing at his wrists as if imagining shackles there. Alice Karstark's brother, Edric, stern-browed, not so old, came with a face that had learned to be calm in 4 days. He met Daenerys Targaryen in a hall of old black stone that had remembered dragons so well that it had almost kept itself warm in their absence. She stood with a stillness that was the expensive kind, the kind that takes a lifetime to learn, surrounded by men who had forgotten how to look at anything they could not buy. Missandei of Noth, Tyrion Lannister with his wine-stained wit, the unsullied captain with the eyes that ached but did not weep. He told her what the winter was. He watched the dragon that hung behind her eyes shift and turn once, uneasy. He knelt. He did not bend his neck. He rather offered it, as his father had offered his, as if to say, "I know what this means. Do not mistake it." She gave him dragonglass. Later she gave him fire in the sky. The 3 dragons wheeling above White Harbor like slow, contained storms. Men who had not believed in anything but bacon and iron cried to see them, then cheered, then cried again, old boys ashamed and unashamed both at once. She came north because she was not a fool, and because Tyrion was not a fool, and because men with swords go where the songs are about to be written. The north received her with the reserve of people who have learned that southern warmth can burn. Jon walked between them. They made plans in the heat of a great hall at Winterfell and in the cold of its yard. They sent ravens that came back slow, heavy with answers. The Karstarks and Umbers took their places not at the edges but near the middle. Harold Karstark died in a skirmish on the Long Lake Road 3 weeks before the dead came. He died with his back to an oak, laughing the laugh of a man who has found in blood a way to wash something clean. Donal lived and learned to listen when Alice spoke, which surprised him, and then not at all. The night the dead came was the night when the moon could not be found. They had chosen not to light the field in front of Winterfell with beacon fires. Light helps men and dead both. They lit instead the trenches they had cut in a ragged maze that men had learned by heart and would forget if they died. They placed the Karstarks on the west wall, the Umbers along the south, Manderley men layered along the inner court where the last stand would be couches pulled together and cups of hot ale emptied fast. Jon took to the air exactly once, because dragons are not horses, and he had learned that his worth was not above men's heads but among them. Daenerys burnt 2 miles of dead to gray and black smolder, and then went high when the wind would not be her friend. The Night King came with that wind and broke it like a toy. In the yard, men's hearts made a sound that never makes it into songs. Arya moved through the castle like quicksilver. Sansa put on leather under her cloak and leaned far over the map, moving pins with hands that no longer shook. Rickon sat at the foot of the heart tree and watched Bran's face. The dead reached the walls like a tide that had never turned in its life. The Karstarks held the west wall with a stubbornness that was itself a weapon. Edric had a moment where he could have swung his men down the stairs to help an Umber not that was breaking under the weight of piled corpses. He did not. He poured oil instead, and men screamed. He wept when they did, and then did it again. Bread and salt is for the living and cannot be offered to the dead. The Umbers on the south had a moment when a section of parapet cracked under the weight of bodies and men leaned outward into the black. Donal roared the way a bear roars when he's lost a cub, and the men leaned back in again. They piled benches against stone and stood on them and made a wall of arms that could not be climbed without breaking. "We are the hands," he said, not knowing he said it aloud, and later he would be ashamed to have made poetry in a place that had no patience for it. In the moment it helped a boy on his left remember which end of his spear to love. Jon crossed the yard 4 times in the night. The first time he saw a wildling he had traded soup with at Hardhome go down under 3 bodies and made the choice not to turn back because sometimes turning back is only dying in a more honest place. The second time he slid in blood and came up with a handful of someone's hair and spat it out without thinking. The third time he almost said Bran's name and then did not, because to say it would be to call something that should not be called. The The fourth time he saw the blue flame in the eyes of a man he had known at the wall and drove Longclaw through him with a sound like breaking a bag of bones. At the last, when the wind went very still and the dead made fewer sounds because there were so many of them they did not need to make many sounds, the Night King stepped into the Godswood. The Karstarks and Umbers were not there. They were elsewhere, being used and using themselves, which is also a kind of piety. Arya came to the place where she would make the world's pivot. It was not neat. She cut her arm on a branch. She lost the handle of a dagger and found the blade. She did what she did. The dead remembered they were dead. The air became white with relief. After, men did not cry because they had learned to spend tears like gold. They sat. They leaned their heads against stone. They found their hands shaking in the peculiar way hands do when they have been very strong for too long. The Karstarks burned their dead under the west wall in a pyre that made the weirwood's leaves shine like old coins. The Umbers burned theirs in the south yard with the rookery's shadows laying bars across the flames. Jon stood with Sansa and watched. Daenerys stood with them and did not speak. She had the look of a woman who has left a room and returned to find that all the cups are still there but each is filled with a different drink. When southern kings and queens later called again, when the business of chairs and iron and bells and breaking cities pressed itself on the north as southerly weather always does, Jon did not forget. He went because winter was broken and this was now the next set of storms. He and Daenerys made decisions that would make other men tell stories in inns. Sansa made decisions that made bread rise and children sleep. Rickon made decisions that made old men smile in halls because they saw in him something of a father they had loved. In a spring that had the courtesy to come slowly, Jon walked out to the winter town with Ghost at his heel and watched a Karstark girl, 14, and an Umber boy, 13, stand arguing over a saw blade they were meant to share. Their voices were sullen and bright. A woman came out from a doorway with flour on her hands and tugged both of them by the ear and made them laugh unwillingly. The saw blade sang. Far off, a hammer struck a nail and waited and struck again. He went in under the heart tree and put his hand on the trunk. The bark felt warmer than it had in months. I pardoned them, he said. The tree said nothing. He thought of the field that morning when everything had been a thin gray promise. He thought of the look that had passed through ranks of men like a cold traveling under skin. We could die for a lord who would not feed our children, or we could stand for a house that knows what bread is. He thought of the crack, the little one, and the way you can push at a crack and make a wall remember it was once many stones. Mercy is a wager, he told the old gods. Ghost sneezed at a drifting seed and snapped at it in irritation and then looked abashed. Jon laughed, quietly, and the laugh made steam. We won that one. The old gods did not answer because they are not in the business of that kind of answer. A leaf turned over in a small breeze that had found its way into the grove and discovered it liked the place. The red underside of the leaf was the color of the meat of a winter apple. Sansa's footsteps came soft on the path. She stood beside him under the carved face's gaze. I have to meet with Manderley, she said. He wants to talk about fishing nets and trade with White Harbor. He wants to tax the Vale caravans twice because he was taxed twice 3 years running. I miss the dead sometimes, Jon said, and she made a sound she had learned to make when she disapproved of the shape a joke took but could not pretend it was not a joke. You will argue with him, she said. You used to be bad at arguing. I'm still bad, he said. I just pick times when men want to agree with me. She smiled. Not a large thing, not a show, but the peel of something hard revealing something sweet. You're better than you think, she said, and reached up and caught a piece of leaf that had drifted down into his hair. They walked back toward the hall. Behind them, the godswood whispered. Somewhere outside the walls, a Karstark boy and an Umber girl were again disagreeing about a tool and learning the small compromises that men call civilization. In the yard, a giant of a man with a beard like a nest taught 3 boys to roll a barrel without dropping it. On the rampart, a woman in green turned her face into the sun and shut her eyes. Jon sat in his father's chair later that day and listened to men speak. Some were strong, some were weak, some were clever, some were trying to hide how much they cared. He passed judgment once on a man who'd stolen grain, and he gave mercy once to a girl who'd taken a chicken. and he sent 2 men away with orders he knew they would balk at and obey anyway, because obeying would make them feel they had chosen well. He ate bread and salt with a Karstark whose mouth had been sour the first time and sweet the second. He drank ale with an Umber and laughed and slapped his back, not because of the joke but because of what laughter does to men who might have killed you 2 winters ago. That night he dreamed of snow falling. Not in war, not in the hush of waiting for it, but the way it falls when no one is watching, when it takes its time because it has no enemies and no friends. In his dream, the snow settled on a field that had once been trampled and now was home to sprouting grass. It settled on the shoulders of men who had laid down, not dead but sleeping, and it melted on their faces like tears and left no mark and made no noise. When he woke, he lay there with his hand on the blanket and felt for the first time in a long while that the day ahead would not ask him to kill a part of himself to get through it. He rose before dawn because that is the hour when men like him are most themselves. He strapped on his belt and went into the yard and pulled at a dummy with his sword to keep his arms honest. He watched Ghost chase a crow out of a corner and then sit with dignity as if he had always intended to sit. He listened to the cook sing to his kettles. He listened to a woman scold a boy for mucking about where he should not muck about. When the sun found Winterfell, slowly, carefully, the gray of its stones looked for a moment like something that had apprenticed itself to the morning. The wind came over the battlements and brought with it the smell of a world that had begun, very cautiously, to be new. Men who had once had their faces turned the other way now leaned over the walls of a place they called home and pointed at the road and said, "Not who comes, but when will he be back? And do you think there will be cod this week?" And she said yes, and she said she would think about it. Bread was set, salt was set, words were said, and the North remembered, and mercy, given like a wager in front of men with hands on spears, had paid out in coin that did not melt no matter how the weather changed.